Captain Sarah Martinez had always known that being one of only 3 female officers in the 2nd Infantry Battalion would bring challenges. What she hadn't expected was to find herself sitting across from Colonel Robert Hayes in his office at Fort Carson, watching him lean back in his leather chair with the kind of skeptical expression that made her stomach clench. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting harsh lines across his weathered face as he tapped his pen against a manila folder. Inside that folder was her after-action report from the convoy incident in Kandahar province 3 weeks ago. The report that could either vindicate her actions or end her military career. "Captain Martinez," the colonel began, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of command, "I've read your account of what happened during the supply run to Forward Operating Base Delta. I have to say, some of the details seem extraordinary." Sarah kept her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap. She'd rehearsed this moment in her mind dozens of times during the flight back from Afghanistan. "Sir, I stand by every word in that report." Colonel Hayes opened the folder and pulled out several typed pages. "According to this, your convoy came under attack approximately 15 kilometers outside the base. You claim that insurgents had set up a complex ambush involving improvised explosive devices, small arms fire, and rocket-propelled grenades." He looked up at her over his reading glasses. "You also claim that you personally engaged multiple enemy combatants while coordinating the defense of your convoy." "That's correct, sir." "Captain, you're a logistics officer. Your job is to ensure supplies get from point A to point B. You're not special forces. You're not infantry." The colonel's tone grew sharper. "Yet your report reads like something out of an action movie." Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Sir, I understand how it might seem unusual, but the situation required immediate action. My convoy was taking heavy fire, and we had wounded personnel who needed medical attention." The colonel stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Outside, she could see soldiers conducting morning PT on the parade ground. Normal military life continuing while her own hung in the balance. "Captain, let me be frank with you. 3 of your convoy personnel have already been interviewed. Their accounts differ significantly from yours. Staff Sergeant Jenkins says he was unconscious for most of the engagement after the first IED blast. Private Rodriguez claims he was pinned down and couldn't see much of anything. Corporal Washington says the whole thing lasted maybe 10 minutes, not the 45 minutes you described." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd known this was coming. The discrepancies in their stories weren't because she was lying. They were because her men had been in shock, wounded, and focused on their own survival. But explaining that to a skeptical commanding officer who already seemed convinced she was fabricating details would be nearly impossible. "Sir, combat situations are chaotic. Different people experience them differently, especially when they're under stress or injured." Colonel Hayes turned back to face her. "That's certainly true, Captain. But there are other inconsistencies that concern me. You claim to have eliminated at least 6 enemy combatants with your M4 carbine. You describe tactical maneuvers that would be impressive coming from a seasoned infantry NCO. And you say you provided medical aid to 3 wounded soldiers while simultaneously directing defensive fire." He returned to his desk and sat down, fixing her with a hard stare. "Captain Martinez, I've been in the Army for 3 decades. I've seen combat in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia. What you're describing sounds less like a realistic engagement and more like someone trying to embellish their role in events to make themselves look heroic." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd expected skepticism, but being accused of fabricating her report was something else entirely. "Sir, with respect, I would never dishonor the service by lying about combat actions." "Wouldn't you?" The colonel leaned forward. "Captain, your career hasn't exactly been stellar up to this point. You've been passed over for promotion twice. Your efficiency reports, while adequate, don't show the kind of leadership potential the Army looks for in its officers. A heroic combat action would certainly help change that narrative." Sarah gripped the arms of her chair. Every word the colonel spoke was technically true, but the implication behind them was devastating. She'd joined the army to serve her country, not to chase medals or promotions. The idea that anyone would think she'd manufacture a story about combat made her feel sick. Sir, I understand your skepticism, but I need you to know that every detail in my report is accurate. I kept a detailed log during and immediately after the engagement. I can provide exact times, ammunition expenditure, casualty reports, everything. Colonel Wavid dismissively. Logs can be fabricated after the fact, Captain. What I need is corroborating evidence. Physical evidence that supports your version of events. The convoy vehicles were documented by the crash investigation team. The damage patterns support the fact that your convoy was attacked. They don't support your specific claims about your personal actions during the engagement. The colonel's voice grew colder. Captain Martinez, I'm going to be direct with you. Based on my review of this incident, I believe you've exaggerated your role in the engagement. I think you performed adequately under fire, as any officer should, but I don't believe you single-handedly saved your convoy or engaged multiple enemy combatants. Sarah felt the room spinning slightly. This was worse than she'd anticipated. Sir, what are you saying exactly? I'm saying that I'm recommending your report be rewritten to reflect a more realistic account of events. I'm also recommending that you be transferred to a non-combat support role where your skills might be better utilized. The colonel closed the folder with finality. The Army doesn't need officers who can't distinguish between reality and fantasy, Captain. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours. Sarah stared at the colonel, trying to process what he'd just said. Her military career, everything she'd worked for, was about to end because he didn't believe she was capable of the action she'd taken. Sir, I request permission to present additional evidence in my defense. Colonel Hayes sighed. Captain, unless you have something substantial, video footage, independent witnesses who weren't part of your convoy, documented enemy casualties, I don't see how additional evidence would change my assessment. Sarah thought about the photographs on her phone, the one she'd taken immediately after the engagement, before the official investigation team arrived. Images of the defensive positions she'd established, the enemy equipment they'd captured, the tactical layout of the ambush site. But would even those convince him? I have photographs of the engagement site that weren't included in the official report, sir. The colonel raised an eyebrow. Personal photographs of a combat zone? Captain, that's against regulation unless specifically authorized for intelligence purposes. I took them from my personal logs, sir, to ensure accuracy in my after-action report. Let me see them. Sarah pulled out her phone, her hands slightly shaky as she navigated to the photo album. She'd looked at these images dozens of times during her flight home, remembering every detail of that day. The fear, the adrenaline, the split-second decisions that had meant the difference between life and death for her soldiers. She handed the phone to Colonel Hayes and watched his expression as he scrolled through the images. His initial skepticism seemed to give way to something else, confusion, perhaps, or surprise. These show significant enemy positions, he said slowly, more than what was in the official report. Yes, sir. The investigation team focused on the IED crater and the immediate area where our vehicles were hit. They didn't fully map the enemy positions because the site was considered too dangerous for extended examination. Colonel Hayes continued scrolling, his frown deepening. This shows what appears to be a coordinated ambush with multiple firing positions. The kind of setup that would require significant planning and resources. Exactly what I described in my report, sir. The colonel set down the phone and looked at her with new attention. Captain, these photographs show a much more complex engagement than what the initial investigation suggested. If this is accurate, then you and your convoy faced a significantly more dangerous situation than anyone realized. For the first time since entering his office, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Sir, that's exactly what I've been trying to tell you. The engagement was far more intense than the initial reports indicated. But the colonel's expression remained guarded. These photographs help establish the complexity of the ambush, but they still don't corroborate your specific actions during the engagement. For all I know, You could have spent the entire firefight hiding behind your vehicle while your NCOs handled the response. The comment stung, but Sarah forced herself to remain professional. Sir, I understand your position. However, I believe there's additional evidence that would support my account. Such as, Sarah hesitated. What she was about to reveal would open up an entirely different conversation, one that might be even more difficult than defending her combat report. But she was running out of options. Sir, during the engagement, I sustained injuries that weren't fully documented in the medical report. Colonel Hayes leaned back in his chair. What kind of injuries? Shrapnel wounds, small fragments from the IED explosions, and incoming rocket fire. I didn't report them at the time because they were minor, and I didn't want to be pulled from duty while my soldiers were still in danger. The colonel's eyes narrowed. Captain, failing to report combat injuries is a serious breach of protocol. It could result in disciplinary action. I understand that, sir. But the wounds were superficial, and I felt my duty was to my soldiers first. Where are these alleged injuries now? Sarah stood up and began unbuttoning her uniform jacket. With your permission, sir, I can show you. Colonel Hayes nodded curtly, and Sarah shrugged out of her jacket, then rolled up the sleeves of her uniform shirt. Along her left forearm were several small, dark marks, puncture wounds that had healed into distinctive scars. The colonel examined her arm without touching it, his expression unreadable. These could be from any number of sources, Captain. Old injuries, accidents, medical procedures. Sarah had expected this response. She rolled up her right sleeve as well, revealing similar marks, then turned to show him her back where fragments had torn through her body armor and embedded themselves in her shoulder blade. Sir, these injuries are consistent with the blast patterns I described in my report. The medical examination I received stateside was focused on ensuring I was fit for duty, not on documenting combat injuries from weeks earlier. The colonel studied the scars more carefully now, and Sarah could see his analytical mind working through the implications. These wounds show a pattern consistent with explosive fragmentation, he admitted. But that still doesn't prove you engaged multiple enemy combatants or performed the tactical maneuvers you described. Sarah felt her frustration building. Every piece of evidence she presented seemed to move the goalposts further away. Sir, what would it take to convince you that my report is accurate? Colonel Hayes returned to his desk and sat down heavily. Captain, I'll be honest with you. In my experience, officers who find themselves in situations like the one you've described either don't survive them, or they come back with significant psychological trauma. You appear to have emerged from this engagement not only unscathed, but apparently enhanced in your confidence and bearing. Sarah stared at him. Sir, are you saying that because I'm not showing signs of PTSD, I must be lying about what happened? I'm saying that in my experience, real combat changes people. It leaves marks that go deeper than physical scars. The colonel's voice softened slightly. Captain, I've seen officers try to reinvent themselves through exaggerated war stories. It never ends well. The accusation hung in the air between them. Sarah realized that no amount of physical evidence would convince Colonel Hayes of her account, because he'd already made up his mind about who she was and what she was capable of. In his view, she was a mediocre logistics officer looking for glory, not a soldier who had risen to meet an extraordinary challenge. Sir, I request a formal investigation into this incident. I want my account to be thoroughly examined by qualified combat veterans who can assess the tactical elements of my report. Colonel Hayes shook his head. Captain, that would require significant resources and time, unless you have compelling new evidence. And I mean evidence that definitively proves your version of events. I can't justify that kind of investigation. Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. She'd presented photographs, shown her injuries, and offered detailed testimony, but none of it seemed to matter. The colonel had decided she was lying, and apparently nothing would change his mind. Sir, with respect, I believe you're making a mistake. My soldiers are alive today because of the actions I took during that engagement. If you refuse to investigate properly, you're not just ending my career, You're sending a message to every female officer in this battalion that their accounts of combat actions won't be believed. The colonel's expression hardened. Captain Martinez, don't make this about gender. This is about credibility and evidence. Your account simply doesn't add up. Then, investigate it properly, sir. Bring in combat experts to review the tactical elements. Interview the enemy prisoners who were captured after the engagement. Examine the weapons and equipment we recovered from the site. What prisoners? Your report doesn't mention any captured enemy personnel. Sarah felt a spark of hope. This was information that hadn't made it into her official report because the prisoners had been immediately transferred to higher command for interrogation. Sir, we captured 3 wounded insurgents during the final phase of the engagement. They were evacuated with our wounded and turned over to intelligence personnel. Colonel Hayes opened her file again and flipped through the pages. There's no mention of prisoners in any of the documentation I have, because they were classified under a separate operation, sir. The intelligence value of the captures was considered significant enough to warrant special handling. The colonel looked up at her with new interest. Captain, are you telling me that there are classified elements to this engagement that weren't included in your after-action report? Sarah nodded. Yes, sir. The prisoners provided information about the insurgent cell that planned the ambush. That information led to follow-up operations that I'm not clear to discuss. For the first time since the meeting began, Colonel Hayes looked uncertain. If there were classified aspects to the engagement that he wasn't aware of, it meant his assessment of the situation might be incomplete. Captain, I need you to understand something. If you're making false claims about classified operations to support your story, the consequences will be severe. I understand that, sir. I'm simply telling you that the full scope of what happened that day may not be reflected in the unclassified portions of my report. The colonel closed the file and leaned back in his chair. Captain Martinez, I'm going to suspend my judgment on this matter pending a review of any classified materials related to your engagement. However, I want to be clear about something. If this investigation determines that you've been dishonest about any aspect of this incident, I will personally ensure that you face the full consequences of your actions. Sarah felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She'd bought herself time, but she knew the real battle was just beginning. Somewhere in the classified files was information that would either vindicate her completely or destroy her career forever. I understand, sir. I welcome a complete investigation. Colonel Hayes stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. Captain, you're dismissed. Report to me in 1 week for a follow-up briefing. In the meantime, you're restricted to base and relieved of active duty pending the outcome of this review. As Sarah gathered her things and prepared to leave, she caught sight of her reflection in the window behind the colonel's desk. She looked tired, stressed, but determined. The woman staring back at her had survived an ambush that should have killed her entire convoy. She made split-second decisions under fire that had saved lives. And now she was being told that none of it mattered because it didn't fit someone else's perception of what she should be capable of. Walking back to her quarters, Sarah thought about the 3 weeks since the engagement. The nightmares, the way she jumped at sudden noises, the constant replaying of events in her mind. Colonel Hayes was wrong about one thing. The engagement had changed her. But not in the way he expected. She discovered reserves of strength and tactical ability she didn't know she possessed. She learned that when everything was on the line, she could rise to meet the challenge. And she'd realized that the Army's perception of her capabilities had been limited not by her actual performance, but by others' assumptions about what a female logistics officer should be able to accomplish. The week ahead would determine whether those discoveries would be acknowledged or buried. As she reached her quarters, Sarah made a mental note to contact Captain Jennifer Walsh, a JAG officer she'd known since their academy days. If this investigation was going to be thorough, she wanted legal representation to ensure her interests were protected. What Colonel Hayes didn't understand was that Sarah wasn't fighting for medals or recognition. She was fighting for the truth and for the principle that every soldier's service should be evaluated based on their actual performance, not on someone else's preconceptions about their capabilities. The battle for her career was just beginning, but Sarah Martinez had already proven she knew how to fight. The JAG office at Fort Carson occupied a corner of the administration building, its sterile fluorescent lighting a stark contrast to the natural Colorado sunshine streaming through barred windows. Captain Jennifer Walsh sat across from Sarah in a conference room that smelled of coffee and legal documents, her laptop open and fingers flying across the keyboard as she took notes. "So let me understand this correctly," Jenny said, pausing to look up at her friend. "Colonel Hayes is essentially accusing you of fabricating portions of your after-action report to make yourself look heroic?" Sarah nodded, feeling the familiar knot in her stomach that had been her constant companion for the past week. "That's the implication. He thinks I'm exaggerating my role in the engagement to boost my career prospects." Jenny shook her head in disgust. "Sarah, I've known you for 8 years. You're the most honest person I've ever met. You once reported yourself for being 2 minutes late to formation because you thought it was the right thing to do. Tell that to Colonel Hayes." Sarah rubbed her temples, fighting off the headache that seemed to be a permanent fixture these days. "Jenny, I need to know what my options are if this investigation goes badly." "Well, that depends on what they find. If they determine you filed a false official report, you could be looking at anything from a reprimand to court-martial, depending on how seriously they want to take it." Jenny's expression was grim. "But, Sarah, based on what you've told me, I think there's something else going on here." "What do you mean?" Jenny leaned forward, her voice dropping slightly even though they were alone in the room. "Think about the timing of this. You're being challenged on a combat action that, if verified, would make you eligible for significant recognition. Bronze Star, maybe even Silver Star territory, depending on the details. Sarah, try not to think about medals or awards. The idea of receiving recognition for actions that have been driven purely by necessity and responsibility for her soldiers felt strange. I never requested any commendations, Jenny. I just filed my report. That's not how it works, and you know it. Combat actions like what you've described get reviewed automatically for decorations. Colonel Hayes has to know that." Jenny paused, her fingers drumming on the table. "Sarah, how many female officers in your battalion have combat awards?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She thought for a moment, mentally reviewing the personnel she knew. "Actually, I don't think any of us do. Most of the women are in support roles, and the few who've deployed haven't seen direct combat." "Exactly. And here comes Captain Sarah Martinez, logistics officer, claiming she engaged multiple enemy combatants and saved her entire convoy." Jenny's tone grew angry. "It threatens the narrative about women's roles in combat, doesn't it?" Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The idea that her gender might be influencing the skepticism about her report hadn't fully occurred to her, but it made sense. "You think that's what this is really about?" "I think it's one factor among several. Look, I'm not saying Colonel Hayes is consciously trying to discriminate against you, but unconscious bias is real, and it affects how people interpret evidence." Jenny pulled up a file on her laptop. "I did some research on similar cases. When male officers file reports describing extraordinary combat actions, they're generally given the benefit of the doubt unless there's strong evidence contradicting their account. And when female officers file similar reports, the standard of evidence required is much higher. They have to prove their accounts beyond any possible doubt." Jenny turned the laptop screen towards Sarah. "I found 3 cases in the past 5 years where female officers had their combat reports questioned in ways that similar reports from male officers weren't." Sarah stared at the screen, reading through case summaries that sounded eerily familiar. Female officers questioned about tactical decisions they'd made under fire. Reports dismissed as unlikely or embellished despite corroborating evidence. Awards delayed or denied while investigations dragged on for months. "This is depressing," Sarah said finally. "What happened to those officers?" "Mixed results. One was eventually vindicated, but only after a congressional inquiry. Another accepted a transfer and never received recognition for her actions. The third—" Jenny paused. She resigned her commission. The weight of that information settled over Sarah like a lead blanket. She joined the army to serve, not to fight battles over whether her service would be believed or respected. But here she was facing exactly that fight. A knock on the conference room door interrupted her brooding. Jenny called out, "Come in," and a young sergeant entered, carrying a manila envelope marked with classification stamps. "Captain Walsh? Colonel Hayes sent this over for Captain Martinez. He said it was urgent." Jenny accepted the envelope and waited for the sergeant to leave before breaking the seal. Inside were several documents, some heavily redacted, and a note from Colonel Hayes written on official letterhead. "What does it say?" Sarah asked, watching Jenny's expression change as she read. "He's obtained some of the classified materials related to your engagement." Jenny's voice was carefully neutral. "The good news is that the intelligence reports from the captured prisoners corroborate significant elements of your story." Sarah felt a surge of relief. "And the bad news?" "The bad news is that the interrogation reports also raise new questions about how exactly you managed to capture 3 armed insurgents while simultaneously coordinating your convoy's defense." Sarah's heart sank. It seemed like every piece of evidence that supported her account somehow generated new skepticism. "What kind of questions?" Jenny read from one of the documents. According to the prisoners, they were part of a 12-man cell that had been planning this ambush for 2 weeks. They had detailed intelligence on convoy routes, timing, and standard defensive procedures. She looked up at Sarah. They also claimed they were defeated by what they describe as a single American soldier who fought like 10 men. That's not. I mean, it wasn't just me. My soldiers, I know, Sarah, but this is how enemy propaganda works. They exaggerate the capabilities of their opponents to explain their own defeats. Jenny continued reading. "The problem is that their descriptions of the engagement are so dramatic that they actually make your account sound more unbelievable, not less." Sarah slumped in her chair. "So even when the evidence supports me, it works against me?" That's what Colonel Hayes is arguing. He's interpreting the prisoner statements as evidence that someone, probably you, has been feeding them an exaggerated version of events to make their defeat seem more acceptable. The accusation was so outrageous that Sarah actually laughed, though there was no humor in it. "He thinks I coached enemy prisoners to make me sound heroic? It's a reach, but it's the kind of thing that raises doubt. And doubt is all he needs to justify his skepticism." Jenny set the documents aside. "Sarah, we need to change our approach. Instead of trying to prove your account is true, we need to focus on the burden of proof." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Colonel Hayes is the one making accusations. He's claiming you filed a false report. The burden should be on him to prove that, not on you to prove your innocence." Jenny opened a new document on her laptop. "We need to request a formal Article 15-6 investigation with specific parameters." Sarah was familiar with Article 15-6 investigations. They were the Army's standard tool for examining allegations of misconduct or unusual incidents. "What kind of parameters?" "First, we demand that the investigating officer be someone with actual combat experience in similar environments. Someone who understands the tactical realities of convoy operations in Afghanistan." Jenny typed as she spoke. "Second, we request that all evidence be evaluated according to the standard used for male officers making similar claims." "Can we actually do that?" "We can request it. Whether it's granted depends on how much pressure we can bring to bear." Jenny saved her document and looked at Sarah seriously. "This is where it gets politically sensitive. Are you prepared to make this about gender discrimination?" Sarah considered the question carefully. She'd never wanted to be the female officer who cried discrimination. She'd wanted to succeed on her own merits, to prove that gender was irrelevant to military effectiveness. But if the system was rigged against her from the start, did she have any choice? What would that involve? Filing a complaint with the Inspector General alleging that your case is being handled differently because of your gender. It would require documenting patterns of bias in how female officers' combat reports are evaluated. Jenny's expression was serious. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. Once you go down that road, there's no coming back. Even if you win, you'll be labeled as a troublemaker. It could affect your career for years. The choice felt impossible. Accept an unjust outcome and let her military service be diminished by someone else's prejudices, or fight back and risk destroying her career in a different way? Is there any chance Colonel Hayes will change his mind based on the classified materials? Jenny consulted the documents again. There's one more piece of information here that might be significant. According to the intelligence summary, the ambush your convoy encountered was part of a larger operation. The insurgent cell was testing new tactics specifically designed to counter American convoy security procedures. What kind of tactics? Coordinated attacks using multiple weapon systems designed to overwhelm standard defensive responses. Jenny highlighted a section of text. The report says that conventional tactical doctrine would have resulted in significant American casualties in this type of engagement. Sarah felt a spark of hope. So my actions prevented casualties that would have occurred if we'd followed standard procedures. That's what the intelligence assessment suggests. But here's the interesting part. The report also notes that the American response to this attack was so effective that the insurgents have changed their tactics. They've abandoned this type of ambush because they consider it too risky. The implications were significant. Sarah's actions hadn't just saved her convoy. They contributed to broader tactical intelligence that was protecting other American forces. But would that be enough to convince Colonel Hayes? I want to fight this, Jenny. But I need to know I have a realistic chance of winning. Jenny closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. Sarah, I'm going to be brutally honest with you. The odds aren't great. The system is designed to protect the chain of command, not individual officers. Even if you're completely vindicated, the process could take months or even years. And if I don't fight, then you accept whatever outcome Colonel Hayes decides. Probably a negative evaluation, possibly a transfer to a less desirable assignment. Your military career continues, but under a cloud of suspicion about your credibility. Sarah thought about her soldiers, Staff Sergeant Jenkins with his wife and 3 kids, Private Rodriguez, who'd been planning to propose to his girlfriend when he got home, Corporal Washington, who'd just gotten accepted to college and was counting on the GI Bill to pay for it. They were all alive because of decisions she'd made under fire. Didn't that count for something? What's the first step? Jenny smiled for the first time since the conversation began. The first step is to request a meeting with Colonel Hayes to present additional evidence. We're going to walk in there with a comprehensive brief that addresses every one of his concerns. What kind of additional evidence? Remember those photographs you showed him? We're going to have them analyzed by a professional combat photographer who can explain exactly what they show in tactical terms. Jenny opened her phone and started scrolling through contacts. I know a retired Special Forces officer who works as a consultant now. He analyzes combat footage for legal proceedings. Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time since this ordeal began, it felt like someone was actually taking her seriously and fighting for her. What else? We're going to request the vehicle damage assessment from your convoy and have them reviewed by an explosives expert. The damage patterns should tell a story about the intensity and duration of engagement. Jenny made notes as she spoke. We're also going to request interviews with the medical personnel who treated your wounded soldiers. Their accounts of the casualties should corroborate the timeline and intensity of the firefight. The plan was comprehensive, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were fighting an uphill battle against predetermined conclusions. Jenny, what if none of this works? What if Colonel Hayes has already made up his mind? Then we escalate. We request a review by the next level of command, and we keep going up the chain until we find someone willing to look at the evidence objectively. Jenny's voice was firm. Sarah, you're not the first officer to face this kind of skepticism, and you won't be the last. But that doesn't mean you have to accept it. A thought occurred to Sarah that made her stomach clench. What about my soldiers? What if this investigation affects them? What do you mean? They've already given statements that don't fully support my account. If this becomes a big investigation, will they be pressured to change their stories? Jenny considered this carefully. That's a legitimate concern. But, Sarah, your soldiers were in shock and focused on their own survival. Their inability to observe everything you did doesn't invalidate your actions. Try telling that to Colonel Hayes. Actually, that's exactly what we're going to tell him. We're going to explain that eyewitness testimony from people in combat situations is inherently limited and unreliable. Jenny pulled up another file on her computer. I've been researching this. There are numerous studies showing that soldiers in firefights often have very limited awareness of what's happening around them. Sarah felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. At least they had a strategy now, a plan for presenting her case in the most favorable light possible. But she also knew that Colonel Hayes wasn't going to make this easy. When do we meet with him? I'll request a meeting for later this week. That gives us time to prepare our presentation and gather the expert analysis we need. Jenny started packing up her materials. Sarah, I need you to prepare yourself for the possibility that this gets worse before it gets better. Worse how? Colonel Hayes might decide to refer this to Criminal Investigation Division if he becomes convinced you filed a false report. That would mean a formal criminal investigation, not just an administrative review. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The idea that she might face criminal charges for honestly reporting her combat actions was almost too much to process. But that won't happen if we can present convincing evidence, right? Jenny's expression was carefully neutral. Sarah, I'm going to do everything I can to ensure you get a fair hearing. But I need you to understand that this situation is serious and the stakes are high. As they prepared to leave the conference room, Sarah caught sight of herself in the reflection of the window. She looked older than she had a month ago, worn down by the stress of defending actions she'd taken to save lives. But she also looked determined. The woman in the reflection had survived an ambush that should have killed her entire convoy. She'd made split-second decisions under fire that had saved American lives and contributed to broader tactical intelligence. And she wasn't going to let anyone erase that truth, no matter how difficult the fight ahead might be. Walking back to her quarters, Sarah thought about the weeks ahead. The investigation, the expert analysis, the formal presentations, and legal briefs. All of it focused on a single question. Could a female logistics officer really have performed the combat actions described in her report? For Sarah, the answer was simple. She knew what had happened that day because she'd lived it. Every decision, every shot fired, every moment of fear and determination was burned into her memory. The question wasn't whether she'd done what she claimed. The question was whether the Army would believe her. As she reached her quarters, Sarah made a silent promise to herself and to her soldiers. She would fight this battle with the same determination she'd shown in Afghanistan. And she would win, not for glory or recognition, but because the truth mattered and because every soldier deserved to have their service acknowledged and respected. The conference room at Fort Carson had been transformed into what looked like a military courtroom. Charts lined the walls, showing tactical diagrams, photograph analyses, and timeline reconstructions. Colonel Hayes sat at one end of the long table, flanked by Major Patricia Coleman, the investigating officer he'd requested from Division, and Captain Frank Morrison, representing the command's interests. At the other end, Sarah sat with Jenny Walsh and their expert witness, retired Master Sergeant David Shunn, whose Special Forces background and post-military career as a combat analyst had made him their star witness. Between them lay 3 weeks of intensive investigation, expert analysis, and legal preparation that would determine Sarah's future in the Army. Major Coleman opened the proceedings with a formality that made Sarah's stomach tighten. Captain Martinez, this Article 15-6 investigation has been convened to examine allegations that you filed an inaccurate after-action report regarding the convoy engagement in Kandahar province on October 15th. You understand that the findings of this investigation could result in administrative or criminal action against you. Yes, ma'am, I understand. Colonel Hayes, please present your concerns regarding Captain Martinez's report. Colonel Hayes stood and activated a wall-mounted display showing Sarah's original after-action report. Ma'am, my primary concern is that Captain Martinez has significantly exaggerated her role in this engagement. Her account describes tactical actions and combat effectiveness that are inconsistent with her training, experience, and the accounts of other personnel present. He clicked through to a comparison chart showing testimonies from her soldiers. As you can see, the other convoy members describe a much shorter, less complex engagement. They report being pinned down and unable to observe much of the action. Yet Captain Martinez claims to have maneuvered between multiple positions, engaged numerous enemy combatants, and directed the convoy's defense for nearly 45 minutes. Major Coleman studied the chart. Colonel, what specifically makes you believe Captain Martinez's account is inaccurate rather than simply more complete than her soldiers' observations? The tactical complexity she describes, ma'am. Captain Martinez is a logistics officer with basic combat training. The maneuver she claims to have executed would be challenging for an experienced infantry soldier. Colonel Hayes pulled up another slide. Additionally, she claims to have engaged 6 enemy combatants at ranges between 50 and 200 meters using an M4 carbine. The accuracy required for those shots under combat stress by someone with her limited weapons training is extremely unlikely. Sarah felt her jaw clench as she listened to the systematic dismantling of her account. Every action she'd taken was being reframed as impossible or improbable, as if her training and determination counted for nothing. Jenny Walsh stood to respond. Ma'am, we'd like to present evidence that directly addresses Colonel Hayes' concerns. Master Sergeant Chun has conducted a comprehensive analysis of the engagement based on photographic evidence, vehicle damage assessments, and enemy intelligence reports. Master Sergeant Chun activated his own presentation, and the room filled with detailed tactical diagrams. Ma'am, I've analyzed over 200 combat engagements during my career, including many involving convoy ambushes. What Captain Martinez describes is tactically sound and consistent with the physical evidence. He pointed to a detailed map of the ambush site. The enemy positions shown in Captain Martinez's photographs indicate a complex, well-planned attack using approximately 12 insurgents in 4 separate firing positions. This type of ambush is designed to overwhelm conventional defensive responses through coordinated fire from multiple directions. Major Coleman leaned forward. Master Sergeant, in your opinion, how would a standard convoy defense have performed against this type of attack? Ma'am, based on the tactical setup and the weapons systems the enemy employed, a conventional defensive response would have resulted in significant casualties. The ambush was specifically designed to counter standard convoy procedures. Chin clicked to the next slide, showing casualty projections. Conservative estimates suggest at least 50% casualties among the convoy personnel if they had remained in fixed defensive positions. Colonel Hayes interrupted. That's speculation, Master Sergeant. We can't know what would have happened if different tactics had been used. With respect, sir, it's informed analysis based on documented enemy tactics and previous engagement outcomes. Chin's voice remained professional but firm. What Captain Martinez did was adapt to the enemy's tactics in real time. She identified that remaining stationary would result in her convoy being destroyed, so she initiated movement and aggressive counterattacks to disrupt the enemy's coordinated fire. Sarah watched Major Coleman's expression carefully. The investigating officer seemed genuinely engaged with the technical aspects of the presentation, asking detailed questions about firing positions, weapon systems, and tactical timing. Master Sergeant Chun, Major Coleman said, you've reviewed Captain Martinez's marksmanship scores and training records. In your opinion, would her documented skill level support the accuracy she claims to have achieved during the engagement? Chun nodded confidently. Yes, ma'am. Captain Martinez consistently scores expert on rifle qualification, which puts her in the top 15% of Army personnel. More importantly, her combat marksmanship course scores show she can maintain accuracy under stress. He pulled up another slide showing ballistics analysis. We also have forensic evidence from the engagement site that supports her marksmanship claims. Bullet impact patterns on enemy positions are consistent with accurate fire from the location she describes. Colonel Hayes looked increasingly uncomfortable as the presentation continued. Major Coleman, even if we accept that Captain Martinez could have made those shots, It doesn't explain how she simultaneously coordinated her convoy's defense, provided medical aid to wounded soldiers, and captured 3 enemy prisoners. Jenny Walsh stood again. Ma'am, we've prepared a detailed timeline reconstruction that addresses that concern. She activated a new presentation showing the engagement broken down into 5-minute segments. What appears impossible when described in summary becomes clear when examined chronologically. The timeline showed how Sarah had moved through different phases of the engagement, delegating responsibilities to her NCOs as the tactical situation evolved. Captain Martinez didn't do everything simultaneously, Jenny explained. She prioritized tasks based on the immediate threat level and the capabilities of her available personnel. Major Coleman studied the timeline carefully. Captain Martinez, walk me through your decision-making process during the engagement. Sarah stood, grateful for the chance to speak for herself. Ma'am, the initial IED blast disabled our lead vehicle and wounded Staff Sergeant Jenkins. I immediately assumed command and assessed our tactical situation. The enemy fire was coming from multiple directions, which meant staying in place would get us all killed. She moved to the tactical diagram. I directed our functional vehicles to move to positions that would allow us to return fire while protecting our wounded. The enemy was expecting us to establish a defensive perimeter and wait for reinforcement, so I decided to attack their positions individually rather than trying to defend against all of them at once. That's a significant tactical decision for a logistics officer to make, Major Coleman observed. Yes, ma'am, but it was the right decision based on the enemy's deployment and our capabilities. Sarah pointed to specific positions on the map. I engaged the closest enemy position first, using covering fire from Corporal Washington. Once that position was neutralized, I moved to the next one. Colonel Hayes shook his head. Major Coleman, what Captain Martinez is describing sounds more like a special forces operation than a convoy defense. Master Sergeant Shun spoke up. Sir, with respect, that's exactly what made Captain Martinez's response so effective. She didn't fight the battle the enemy expected. She adapted her tactics to the situation rather than following doctrine. The room fell silent as Major Coleman reviewed her notes. Sarah could feel her heart hammering as the investigating officer processed everything they presented. 3 weeks of work, expert analysis, and legal preparation had led to this moment. I'd like to examine the physical evidence regarding Captain Martinez's injuries, Major Coleman said finally. Captain, you stated that you sustained shrapnel wounds during the engagement that weren't fully documented at the time. Sarah nodded and rolled up her sleeves, displaying the scarred puncture wounds on her arms. Ma'am, these injuries occurred during the IED explosions and incoming rocket fire. I didn't report them immediately because they were minor and I didn't want to be evacuated while my soldiers needed medical attention. Major Coleman examined the scars carefully, then consulted with a medical expert who had been reviewing Sarah's case. After a whispered conversation, she returned her attention to the room. The medical assessment confirms that these injuries are consistent with combat-related shrapnel wounds and that they occurred within the time frame Captain Martinez described. She made notes in her file. Captain Martinez, why didn't you report these injuries when you filed your after-action report? Ma'am, I was focused on documenting the tactical aspects of the engagement and ensuring my soldiers received proper recognition for their performance. My injuries seemed insignificant by comparison. Colonel Hayes leaned forward. Major Coleman, even if we accept that Captain Martinez was wounded during the engagement, it doesn't validate her claims about enemy casualties or prisoner captures. Jenny Walsh anticipated this objection. Ma'am, we have documentation from the intelligence personnel who interrogated the captured insurgents. Their statements corroborate significant elements of Captain Martinez's account. She handed Major Coleman a folder containing translated interrogation transcripts. The prisoners described being defeated by aggressive American tactics that disrupted their planned ambush. They specifically mentioned being surprised by movement and coordinated counterattacks. Major Coleman reviewed the transcripts carefully. These statements do support Captain Martinez's tactical description, but they also contain some dramatic language about American combat effectiveness. Ma'am, that's consistent with how insurgent groups explain military defeats, Master Sergeant explained. They exaggerate their opponent's capabilities to justify their own failures. But the core tactical details they describe match Captain Martinez's account. Sarah watched Colonel Hayes as he realized that his case was falling apart. Every piece of evidence they presented supported her version of events, and his skepticism was beginning to look like prejudice rather than professional judgment. Major Coleman closed the interrogation transcripts and looked directly at Sarah. Captain Martinez, I want you to understand something. The actions you've described represent exceptional combat performance by any standard. Are you certain that your account is accurate and complete? Ma'am, I stake my military career and personal honor on the accuracy of my report. Every detail I've described happened exactly as I stated. The room fell silent again as Major Coleman consulted her notes one final time. Sarah could feel the weight of everyone's attention as the investigating officer prepared to render her judgment. Based on my review of all available evidence, including expert analysis, physical documentation, and corroborating intelligence reports, I find that Captain Martinez's after-action report is accurate and credible. Major Coleman's voice was firm and clear. The tactical actions she describes are supported by physical evidence and consistent with the combat situation she faced. Sarah felt a rush of relief so intense that she had to grip the table to steady herself. After weeks of having her integrity questioned, someone with authority had finally acknowledged the truth of what had happened. But Major Coleman wasn't finished. However, I also find that this incident raises broader questions about how we evaluate and recognize combat performance among our officers. She turned to face Colonel Hayes directly. Sir, the skepticism you expressed about Captain Martinez's account appears to have been based more on assumptions about her capabilities than on objective analysis of the evidence. Colonel Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Ma'am, I was simply exercising appropriate professional skepticism regarding an extraordinary claim. Sir, the evidence shows that Captain Martinez's combat performance was indeed extraordinary. But extraordinary circumstances often require extraordinary responses. Major Coleman's tone grew pointed. I recommend that this command review its procedures for evaluating combat reports to ensure that all personnel receive fair and objective assessment regardless of their background or specialization. Sarah realized that Major Coleman was diplomatically telling Colonel Hayes that his handling of her case had been inappropriate without directly accusing him of bias. Additionally, Major Coleman continued, I recommend that Captain Martinez be considered for appropriate recognition of her combat actions. Her performance during this engagement represents the highest traditions of Army leadership and deserves acknowledgement. The formal proceedings concluded with administrative details and timelines, but Sarah barely heard them. As the room emptied and people gathered their materials, she felt a profound sense of vindication mixed with exhaustion from the ordeal. Colonel Hayes approached her as she was packing up her notes. His expression was difficult to read, but there was something that might have been respect in his eyes. Captain Martinez, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. I let my preconceptions cloud my judgment of your capabilities. Sarah looked at him carefully, trying to gauge his sincerity. Sir, I appreciate that. I hope this experience helps you evaluate other officers more objectively in the future. The colonel nodded. It will. And, Captain, for what it's worth, I'm glad I was wrong about you. As Colonel Hayes walked away, Jenny Walsh appeared at Sarah's side. How do you feel? Sarah considered the question carefully. Vindicated, exhausted, and a little angry that it took this much effort to get someone to believe the truth. That's understandable. But you won, Sarah? Not just the investigation, but something bigger. Jenny gestured toward the tactical diagrams still displayed on the walls. You proved that excellence in combat isn't limited by gender or specialty. That matters for every female officer who comes after you. Sarah looked at the evidence that had finally convinced the Army of her combat effectiveness. Photographs, ballistics analysis, medical documentation, expert testimony, all of it supporting what she had known from the beginning. She had performed exceptionally under fire and saved her soldiers' lives. But the victory felt complicated. She'd been forced to fight a second battle just to have her first battle acknowledged. How many other officers had faced similar skepticism and chosen not to fight? How many extraordinary actions had been dismissed because they didn't fit someone's expectations? Master Sergeant Chun joined them as they prepared to leave. "Captain, I wanted to tell you something. In my 23 years in Special Forces, I've seen a lot of combat leaders. What you did in Afghanistan would have made any of them proud." The words meant more to Sarah than any medal could have. Recognition from someone who understood combat leadership validated not just her actions, but her identity as a soldier. Walking back to her quarters that evening, Sarah thought about the convoy engagement that had started this entire ordeal. Staff Sergeant Jenkins, Private Rodriguez, and Corporal Washington were all alive and healthy, serving their country and supporting their families. That had been her goal during the firefight, and that remained her measure of success. The Army had finally acknowledged her combat performance, but more importantly, she learned something about herself during the investigation. She discovered that she could fight just as effectively in a conference room as she had in Afghanistan, that she could maintain her integrity under intense pressure, and that she wouldn't back down when the truth was at stake. 3 months later, Captain Sarah Martinez stood on the parade ground at Fort Carson as Major Patricia Coleman pinned the Bronze Star Medal with V device to her uniform. The citation read, "For exceptionally valorous conduct during combat operations against an armed enemy force." In the audience, Colonel Hayes applauded along with everyone else. He learned something too during the investigation, that exceptional performance could come from unexpected places and that a leader's job was to recognize and nurture excellence wherever it appeared. Sarah's soldiers from the convoy were there as well, finally, understanding the full scope of what their convoy commander had accomplished that day. They'd survived because someone had refused to accept that their situation was hopeless, had adapted tactics in real time, and had fought with skill and determination that saved all their lives. But for Sarah, the real victory wasn't the medal or the recognition. It was the knowledge that she'd stood up for the truth and, one, that she'd proven herself capable of excellence under the most challenging circumstances, and that her example might make it easier for other officers who found themselves in similar situations. The Bronze Star was nice, but the real reward was serving in an army that had finally acknowledged what she'd always known, that courage, skill, and leadership weren't limited by anyone's preconceptions about who could possess them. As the ceremony concluded and she shook hands with the officers and soldiers who had gathered to honor her, Sarah Martinez felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal recognition and everything to do with serving alongside people who understood that in the end, what mattered wasn't whether anyone believed you could be exceptional. What mattered was actually being exceptional when it counted most.